When someone cuts you off in traffic and your immediate thought is, "What an absolute jerk," followed by a cascade of assumptions about their character, their upbringing, and possibly their entire lineage, you're witnessing the remarkable speed at which our minds construct reality. This construction happens so quickly, so automatically, that we rarely pause to consider that we're not actually experiencing the event itself. We're experiencing our interpretation of it. And here's where things get interesting from a clinical perspective. That interpretation, that split second meaning making process, might be the single most powerful determinant of whether you arrive at your destination feeling relatively peaceful or ready to punch a wall. Welcome to Strides to Solutions. I'm Esther Adams, where we explore the intersection of clinical psychology, neuroscience, and real world application to help you navigate life's complexities with greater skill and understanding. After over a decade of working with individuals struggling with everything from daily anxiety to profound trauma, I've become fascinated by a particular moment, that split second between when something happens and when we react to it. Today, we're going to dive deep into that space because what I've learned, both from research and from thousands of clinical hours, is that this tiny gap might be where our freedom actually lives. Not the freedom to control what happens to us, but something perhaps more valuable, the freedom to influence what we make of what happens to us. The field of cognitive psychology has spent decades unpacking this phenomenon, and what we've discovered challenges some of our most basic assumptions about stress and emotion. We tend to think stress happens to us, that it's an inevitable response to external circumstances. But the research tells a different story. It suggests that between any event and our emotional response to it lies a crucial intermediary, our perception. And unlike the events themselves, which we often can't control, our perceptions are surprisingly malleable if we know how to work with them. This isn't about positive thinking in the superficial sense that's been packaged and sold in countless self help books. It's not about slapping a smile on your face and pretending everything is fine when your world is falling apart. Instead, it's about understanding the actual mechanics of how thoughts form, how they influence our physiological stress response, and most importantly, how we can intervene in this process when our default patterns aren't serving us well. The clinical term for this intervention is cognitive restructuring, though it goes by many names: reframing, cognitive reappraisal, thought challenging. At its core, it's about recognizing that the story we tell ourselves about what's happening is often more impactful than what's actually happening. Consider for a moment how two people can experience the exact same event, say being laid off from a job, and have completely different responses. One person might spiral into despair, seeing it as confirmation that they're a failure, that nothing ever works out for them, that their future is ruined. Another might feel initial disappointment, but then experience a sense of relief, even excitement about new possibilities. Same event, radically different internal experiences. The difference isn't in the event itself or even necessarily in the people's circumstances. It's in the meaning they've assigned to the event, the narrative they've constructed around it. This narrative construction begins almost instantaneously. Sensory information hits our brain: the boss's serious expression, the words, "We need to talk," the HR representative in the room, and within milliseconds, our brain is pattern matching against past experiences, cultural scripts, personal fears, and expectations. By the time we're consciously aware of what's happening, we've already begun responding not to the raw event, but to our interpretation of it. And that interpretation, particularly when we're under stress, tends to be narrow, defensive, and often catastrophically negative. The roots of this understanding go back to the early 1960s when Albert Ellis developed what he called rational emotive behavior therapy, or REBT. Ellis was something of a maverick in the psychotherapy world, challenging the prevailing psychoanalytic wisdom that our problems stem primarily from deep unconscious conflicts rooted in childhood. Instead, he proposed something almost embarrassingly simple: that our emotional distress comes largely from irrational beliefs about what should or shouldn't happen, what we can or can't tolerate, what we or others must or mustn't do. He suggested that by identifying and challenging these beliefs, we could fundamentally alter our emotional experience. This was revolutionary thinking at the time. The dominant therapeutic model involved years of excavating childhood experiences, analyzing dreams, exploring the unconscious. Ellis was suggesting that maybe, just maybe, we could cut to the chase by dealing directly with the thoughts that were maintaining our distress in the present moment. He wasn't saying the past didn't matter. Clearly, our early experiences shape our belief systems, but he was proposing that regardless of how these beliefs formed, we could work with them now, in real time, to reduce suffering. The approach was initially met with significant skepticism, but as research accumulated, it became increasingly clear that Ellis was onto something important. Studies began showing that people could indeed be taught to identify and modify their thought patterns, and that doing so had measurable impacts not just on their subjective well being, but on their physiology. We now know, for instance, that catastrophic thinking, the tendency to imagine worst case scenarios, actually activates the body's stress response system in ways that can suppress immune function, elevate blood pressure, and contribute to a host of stress related disorders. What makes this particularly fascinating from a clinical perspective is that the thoughts themselves don't need to be about real threats to trigger these physiological responses. Your body doesn't distinguish between a tiger actually chasing you and you vividly imagining being chased by a tiger. The stress response system activates either way. This means that people who habitually engage in what we call awfulizing, imagining terrible outcomes, dwelling on potential catastrophes, are essentially bathing their bodies in stress hormones even when they're objectively safe. I find it helpful to think about this using the information processing model that cognitive scientists have developed. Picture your mind as a kind of computer, though obviously far more complex and nuanced. Sensory information comes in, that's your input. This information then goes through various processing stages where it's interpreted, categorized, compared with stored memories, assigned meaning. Finally, there's an output, your emotional and behavioral response. But here's the key insight: problems can occur at any stage of this process, and particularly in the interpretation phase. Under normal circumstances, this interpretation process serves us well. It helps us quickly assess situations, recognize patterns, anticipate problems. But under chronic stress, or when we've developed certain habitual thought patterns, this system can become miscalibrated. We might start interpreting neutral events as threatening, minor setbacks as catastrophes, other people's actions as deliberate slights. Once these interpretive patterns become established, they tend to be self reinforcing. We see what we expect to see, notice what confirms our beliefs, and dismiss what doesn't fit our narrative. The research on this is quite compelling. Studies have shown that people experiencing depression, for instance, demonstrate what's called negative attention bias. They literally notice and remember negative information more readily than positive information. Their perceptual field narrows, both metaphorically and, as optometrist Jacob Liberman's research suggests, literally. Under stress, our actual field of vision constricts. We see less of what's around us, miss contextual cues that might moderate our interpretation of events. We become, in a very real sense, narrow minded. This narrowing isn't just perceptual, it's also cognitive. When we're stressed, we tend to fall back on familiar thought patterns, even when those patterns aren't particularly helpful. We lose cognitive flexibility, the ability to see situations from multiple angles, or to generate creative solutions. This is why someone in the grip of anxiety might perseverate on the same worry for hours, turning it over and over without ever arriving at a new insight or solution. The thought process becomes like a record needle stuck in a groove, repeating the same few bars of a song ad nauseum. But here's where the hope lies. Just as these patterns can be learned, they can be unlearned. Or perhaps more accurately, new patterns can be developed that compete with and eventually override the old ones. This is the essence of cognitive restructuring, not eliminating negative thoughts entirely, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but developing the capacity to recognize when our thoughts are distorted and to generate alternative, more balanced perspectives. The process sounds simple enough in theory. Notice your thoughts, evaluate them for accuracy and helpfulness, and if they're neither accurate nor helpful, replace them with thoughts that are. But anyone who's tried this knows it's far from easy. Our thoughts feel true to us, especially the ones we've been thinking for years. They feel less like interpretations and more like direct perceptions of reality. When you're convinced that everyone at the party is judging you, it doesn't feel like a thought, it feels like a fact. This is where understanding the nature of cognitive distortions becomes crucial. David Burns, in his work on cognitive therapy, identified several common patterns of distorted thinking that tend to maintain and amplify distress. There's all or nothing thinking, where everything is seen in black and white terms with no middle ground. There's overgeneralization, where a single negative event is seen as part of an endless pattern of defeat. There's mental filtering, where we fixate on one negative detail and filter out everything positive. There's mind reading, where we assume we know what others are thinking, usually assuming it's negative. There's fortune telling, where we predict negative outcomes with unwarranted certainty. I've noticed in my years working with people that these distortions often feel protective. The person who always expects the worst might feel they're being realistic, preparing themselves for disappointment. The person who reads criticism into every interaction might feel they're being vigilant, protecting themselves from hurt. In a strange way, negative thinking can feel safer than hope. If you expect nothing good, you can't be disappointed. If you assume everyone will eventually reject you, you won't be blindsided when someone does. But this protective stance comes at an enormous cost. It's exhausting to be constantly braced for catastrophe. It's isolating to assume everyone is judging or rejecting you. And ironically, these defensive patterns often create the very outcomes we're trying to avoid. The person who expects rejection might behave in ways that actually push others away. The person who expects failure might not try hard enough to succeed. This is what psychologists call a self-fulfilling prophecy, and it's one of the most insidious ways that our thoughts shape our reality. Yet there's something else operating here that often goes unaddressed in discussions of cognitive restructuring, something that I think explains why changing our thoughts can be so difficult despite our best conscious efforts. It's the role of the unconscious mind, particularly what we might call the psychological unconscious, those patterns of thought and behavior that operate outside our awareness but powerfully influence our conscious experience. You see, while we might consciously decide to think more positively to challenge our negative assumptions, there might be a part of us that's deeply invested in maintaining those negative patterns. This isn't perversity or self sabotage in the conventional sense. Often, these patterns served a protective function at some point in our lives. The child who learned to expect criticism might have been protecting themselves from the pain of hope. The person who learned to assume they're not good enough might have been trying to avoid the risk of really trying and failing. These early adaptive strategies become encoded in what we might think of as our psychological operating system. They run in the background, influencing our perceptions and reactions without our conscious awareness. This is why someone might consciously want to believe they deserve love and success, might even repeat positive affirmations daily, yet still find themselves mysteriously sabotaging relationships or opportunities. The conscious mind is saying one thing, but the unconscious is running a different program entirely. Bruce Lipton, whose work bridges cellular biology and psychology, talks about this in terms of programming and reprogramming. He suggests that many of our limiting beliefs are essentially recorded in our early years when our brains are in a highly programmable state. These early recordings then play on repeat throughout our lives, influencing our behavior in ways we might not even recognize. The challenge isn't just changing our conscious thoughts, but actually accessing and modifying these deeper programs. This might sound daunting, and in some ways it is, but I've also seen remarkable transformations when people begin to work at both levels, conscious and unconscious. Sometimes this involves techniques like hypnotherapy or EMDR that can access and modify unconscious patterns. Sometimes it involves somatic approaches that work with the body's stored memories and reactions. And sometimes consistent conscious effort to restructure thoughts gradually begins to influence deeper patterns like water wearing away stone. One approach I find particularly interesting is neurolinguistic programming, or NLP, developed by Richard Bandler and John Grinder. While NLP has its critics and some of its claims are overstated, the basic premise is sound. The language we use, both in our internal dialogue and our external communication, shapes our experience. By becoming aware of our linguistic patterns and consciously modifying them, we can influence our emotional and behavioral responses. For instance, consider the difference between saying, I am depressed versus, I'm experiencing some feelings of depression. The first statement makes depression part of your identity. The second acknowledges it as a temporary experience. Or consider, I can't handle this versus, this is challenging and I'm still learning how to manage it. The first is a declaration of inability. The second acknowledges difficulty while leaving room for growth and change. These might seem like semantic quibbles, but language matters more than we often realize. The words we use don't just describe our experience, they actively construct it. When we say, I'm terrible at relationships, we're not just reporting a fact, we're reinforcing a belief that will influence how we behave in relationships, what we notice about our interactions, what we remember, and what we forget. We're essentially programming ourselves for relationship failure. The power of this programming was dramatically illustrated in a study conducted at the University of Pennsylvania. Researchers divided participants into optimists and pessimists based on psychological assessments, then exposed both groups to minor pathogens to test their immune response under stress. The pessimists showed significantly greater immune suppression, developing more pronounced reactions to the pathogens. Their negative thinking patterns weren't just making them feel worse emotionally, they were literally making them more vulnerable to physical illness. This connection between thought and physiology shouldn't be surprising when we understand how the stress response system works. When we perceive a threat, and remember the perception is what matters, not whether the threat is real, our bodies launch a complex cascade of physiological changes. Stress hormones flood our system, our heart rate increases, blood flow is redirected, immune function is suppressed. This response is perfectly adaptive when facing an actual, immediate threat. The problem is that our modern stressors tend to be chronic and largely psychological, and our bodies aren't designed to be in a constant state of stress arousal. What this means is that someone who chronically engages in catastrophic thinking, who constantly anticipates disaster, who interprets every ambiguous situation as threatening, is essentially keeping their stress response system constantly activated. They're marinating in stress hormones, wearing down their body's systems, setting themselves up for a host of stress related health problems. The thoughts themselves become a source of genuine physiological stress. But again, and I want to emphasize this because it's so important, the solution isn't to simply think positive in some superficial way. That's not only ineffective, it can actually be harmful. When we try to suppress negative thoughts or paste positive thoughts over genuine concerns, we often create additional stress. We're not only dealing with the original problem, but also with the pressure to feel differently than we do. Instead, the approach that seems most effective is what we might call realistic reappraisal. This involves looking at situations from multiple angles, considering various interpretations, and choosing perspectives that are both accurate and useful. It's not about denying problems or minimizing genuine challenges. It's about ensuring that our interpretation of events is proportional and balanced, that we're seeing the full picture rather than fixating on the negative aspects. Viktor Frankl's experience in Nazi concentration camps provides perhaps the most powerful example of this principle. Frankl observed that even in the most horrific circumstances imaginable, people retain the ability to choose their response, to find meaning in their suffering. He didn't minimize the horror of the camps or engage in false optimism. Instead, he found ways to maintain his humanity, to find purpose even in the midst of unimaginable suffering. He later wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." This is a profound insight, and one that's been validated by decades of research. We might not be able to control what happens to us, but we have more control than we realize over how we interpret and respond to what happens. This doesn't mean we're responsible for all our suffering or that people facing genuine hardship just need to think differently. That would be both cruel and inaccurate. But it does mean that even in difficult circumstances, we might have more agency than we realize. The process of developing this agency, of learning to work skillfully with our thoughts, typically involves several stages. First, there's awareness, simply noticing our thoughts rather than being completely identified with them. This is harder than it sounds. Most of us are so immersed in our thought stream that we don't realize we're thinking. We just experience the emotional aftermath of our thoughts. Learning to step back and observe our thoughts as mental events rather than absolute truths is a crucial first step. This is where practices like meditation can be incredibly helpful. Meditation isn't about emptying the mind or achieving some state of blissful tranquility, despite popular misconceptions. It's about developing the capacity to observe our mental processes without being completely caught up in them. It's about recognizing that thoughts are just thoughts, mental events that arise and pass away, rather than solid, unchangeable facts about reality. Once we develop some capacity for awareness, we can begin to evaluate our thoughts more objectively. Is this thought accurate? Is it helpful? Is it proportional to the situation? Are there other ways of looking at this? What would I tell a friend who was having this thought? This evaluation process isn't about judging ourselves for having negative thoughts. That just adds another layer of negativity. It's about developing discernment, the ability to distinguish between thoughts that reflect reality and thoughts that are distorted by stress, fear, or habitual patterns. The next stage involves generating alternative perspectives. If my initial thought is this presentation is going to be a disaster, what are some other possibilities? Maybe it will go well, maybe it will be average, maybe some parts will go well and others won't. Maybe even if it doesn't go perfectly, I'll learn something valuable. Maybe the consequences of a poor presentation aren't as catastrophic as I'm imagining. The point isn't to convince ourselves that everything will be perfect, but to recognize that our catastrophic prediction is just one of many possible outcomes, and probably not the most likely one. This might sound like a lot of mental work, and initially, it is. When we're first learning to restructure our thoughts, the process can feel artificial and effortful. We have to consciously catch ourselves in the act of negative thinking, consciously evaluate those thoughts, consciously generate alternatives. It's like learning to drive. At first, every action requires deliberate attention, but over time, with practice, it becomes more automatic. We develop new mental habits, new default patterns that are more balanced and realistic. I want to address something that often comes up when people learn about cognitive restructuring: the fear that they're lying to themselves or engaging in denial. This is an important concern. We don't want to minimize genuine problems or ignore real threats. If someone is in an abusive relationship, for instance, the solution isn't to reframe the abuse as acceptable. If someone is facing genuine discrimination or injustice, the answer isn't to think more positively about it. Cognitive restructuring isn't about denying reality. It's about ensuring that our perception of reality is accurate and complete. It's about distinguishing between what's actually happening and the stories we're telling ourselves about what's happening. Sometimes those stories are accurate and our negative emotions are entirely appropriate. But often, especially when we're stressed or anxious, our stories become distorted, exaggerated, catastrophic. We lose perspective, and with it, our ability to respond effectively. There's also the question of when to use cognitive restructuring versus when to practice acceptance. Sometimes the most skillful response to a difficult situation isn't to reframe it, but to accept it as it is. This is particularly true for situations we truly cannot change: a loss, an illness, a fundamental uncertainty about the future. Fighting against unchangeable reality only creates additional suffering. As the Serenity Prayer puts it, we need the wisdom to know the difference between what we can and cannot change. Acceptance doesn't mean resignation or giving up. It means acknowledging reality as it is rather than as we wish it were. It means making peace with uncertainty, with imperfection, with the fundamental unpredictability of life. Paradoxically, this acceptance often creates the mental space needed for effective action. When we stop wasting energy fighting against what is, we have more energy available to work with what is. The distinction between cognitive restructuring and acceptance isn't always clear cut. Often we need both. We might need to accept that a situation is difficult while restructuring our thoughts about what that difficulty means. We might need to accept that we have certain limitations while challenging our beliefs about what those limitations imply for our worth or our future. I found that people often struggle with the idea of acceptance because it feels like giving up or giving in, but acceptance in the psychological sense is actually quite active. It requires consciously choosing to stop struggling against reality, to stop insisting that things should be different than they are. It's about redirecting our energy from futile resistance to skillful response. This brings us to an interesting paradox in working with thoughts. On one hand, we're recognizing that thoughts have tremendous power to shape our experience. On the other hand, we're learning not to take our thoughts too seriously, to see them as mental events rather than absolute truths. We're simultaneously acknowledging the importance of thoughts and developing a lighter relationship with them. This paradox points to something important about mental health and resilience. It's not about achieving some state where we only have positive thoughts or where we're never troubled by difficult emotions. It's about developing flexibility in how we relate to our mental experience. Sometimes that means actively restructuring unhelpful thoughts. Sometimes it means accepting difficult thoughts and feelings without trying to change them. Sometimes it means redirecting our attention away from thought altogether and into sensory experience or meaningful action. The research on this is particularly interesting when we look at different therapeutic approaches. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, which focuses heavily on identifying and changing thoughts, has strong empirical support for treating depression and anxiety. But so does acceptance and commitment therapy, ACT, which focuses more on changing our relationship with thoughts rather than changing the thoughts themselves. And mindfulness based approaches, which emphasize observing thoughts without judgment, also show significant benefits. What this suggests is that there isn't one right way to work with thoughts. Different approaches work for different people in different situations. The key seems to be developing a repertoire of skills, a toolkit we can draw from depending on what's needed in any given moment. Sometimes we need to challenge a distorted thought actively. Sometimes we need to accept an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes we need to step back from thinking altogether and ground ourselves in immediate experience. This flexibility is particularly important when dealing with trauma or deep seated patterns. Traumatic experiences can create what we might think of as cognitive landmines, thoughts or beliefs that are so charged with emotion that they overwhelm our capacity for rational reappraisal. I'm fundamentally broken. The world is dangerous. I can't trust anyone. These kinds of core beliefs, often formed in response to trauma, don't readily yield to logical challenge. Working with trauma based thoughts often requires a different approach, one that addresses not just the cognitive level, but also the emotional and somatic levels. This might involve techniques like EMDR, which uses bilateral stimulation to help reprocess traumatic memories. It might involve somatic therapies that work with the body's stored trauma responses. It might involve careful graduated exposure to feared situations or memories in a safe, controlled context. What's crucial to understand is that trauma based thoughts aren't simply irrational beliefs that can be reasoned away. They're often protective strategies that helped someone survive an overwhelming experience. Challenging these thoughts too directly or too quickly can actually increase distress. The process needs to be gentle, respectful, acknowledging the protective function these thoughts once served while gradually developing new, more adaptive patterns. This is where the therapeutic relationship becomes so important. Having someone who can hold space for our experience, who can offer a different perspective without invalidating our own, who can model a different way of relating to difficult thoughts and feelings. This can be transformative. It's one thing to read about cognitive restructuring in a book. It's another thing entirely to have someone skillfully guide you through the process, especially when working with deeply entrenched patterns. But not everyone has access to therapy, and even for those who do, the real work often happens outside the therapy room. This is why developing self directed cognitive restructuring skills is so valuable. Learning to be your own compassionate observer, your own gentle challenger of distorted thoughts, your own source of alternative perspectives. These are skills that can serve you throughout life. One practical approach I often recommend is keeping what we might call a thought journal. When you notice yourself feeling stressed, anxious, or depressed, take a moment to write down what you're thinking. Not what you're feeling, that's important too, but for this exercise, focus on the thoughts. What story are you telling yourself about what's happening? What assumptions are you making? What are you predicting will happen? Then, with as much objectivity and compassion as you can muster, evaluate these thoughts. Are they accurate? Are they helpful? Are there other ways of looking at the situation? What would you tell a friend who was having these thoughts? What would someone who loves you say about these thoughts? Writing this down makes the process more concrete, helps you step outside your own perspective, and creates a record you can return to. Over time, you might start to notice patterns. Maybe you tend toward fortune telling when you're anxious, always predicting the worst possible outcome. Maybe you engage in mind reading when you're feeling insecure, assuming others are judging you. Maybe you fall into all or nothing thinking when you're stressed, seeing everything in extreme terms. Recognizing these patterns is the first step to changing them. It's worth noting that some people find the whole idea of challenging their thoughts invalidating or frustrating. I know my thoughts aren't rational, they might say, but I can't help thinking them. This is where understanding the nature of automatic thoughts becomes helpful. These thoughts aren't chosen. They arise automatically based on our conditioning, our past experiences, our current state. We're not responsible for having these thoughts, but we can develop responsibility for how we respond to them. This is a crucial distinction. You're not a bad person for having negative thoughts. You're not weak for struggling with anxiety or depression. You're not failing if you can't immediately restructure every negative thought into a positive one. These patterns developed over years, often for understandable reasons. Changing them takes time, practice, and often considerable courage. I think it's also important to acknowledge that our society doesn't make this work easy. We live in a culture that often promotes catastrophic thinking. News media focuses overwhelmingly on negative events. Social media algorithms amplify outrage and fear. Advertising deliberately triggers insecurity to sell products. Political discourse increasingly relies on fear mongering and demonization. We're swimming in a sea of cognitive distortions, and it takes real effort to maintain a balanced perspective. This societal dimension is often overlooked in discussions of cognitive restructuring, which tend to focus on individual thought patterns. But our thoughts don't exist in a vacuum. They're shaped by the messages we receive, the conversations we have, the media we consume. Part of developing healthier thought patterns might involve being more selective about what we expose ourselves to, seeking out sources of balance and perspective, surrounding ourselves with people who model realistic rather than catastrophic thinking. There's interesting research on this social dimension of thought patterns. Studies have shown that emotions and attitudes can be contagious, spreading through social networks like viruses. If you're surrounded by people who constantly catastrophize, who always expect the worst, who interpret everything through a negative lens, it's going to be much harder to maintain balanced thinking. Conversely, being around people who model resilience, who can acknowledge difficulties without being overwhelmed by them, who maintain perspective even in challenging times, this can support our own cognitive flexibility. This doesn't mean we should only associate with relentlessly positive people or avoid anyone who's struggling. That would be neither realistic nor compassionate. But it does mean being mindful of how our social environment influences our thinking and making conscious choices about how to balance different influences. The role of culture in shaping thought patterns is also worth considering. Different cultures have different ways of interpreting events, different beliefs about control and agency, different attitudes toward emotion and expression. What's considered realistic thinking in one culture might be seen as pessimistic or optimistic in another. Someone raised in a culture that emphasizes acceptance and fate might have different automatic thoughts than someone raised in a culture that emphasizes individual control and responsibility. This cultural dimension adds another layer of complexity to cognitive restructuring. We're not just working with individual thought patterns, but with deeply embedded cultural scripts about how to interpret experience. This is why culturally sensitive approaches to therapy are so important. A cognitive restructuring approach that works well for someone from a Western individualistic culture might need significant modification for someone from a more collectivist or fatalistic cultural background. I've also noticed generational differences in how people relate to their thoughts. Younger generations who've grown up with social media and constant connectivity often struggle with comparison based thoughts, constantly measuring themselves against idealized representations of others' lives. They might be more aware of mental health concepts, but also more prone to pathologizing normal emotional responses. Older generations might have different challenges, perhaps more stigma around mental health, more rigid thought patterns, but also sometimes more realistic expectations about life's difficulties. These differences remind us that there's no one size fits all approach to working with thoughts. What helps one person might not help another. What works in one life stage might not work in another. The key is developing self awareness and flexibility, learning what works for you while remaining open to new approaches as circumstances change. As I reflect on the thousands of conversations I've had about thoughts and stress, what strikes me most is how much unnecessary suffering comes from our relationship with our own minds. It's not just the difficult events in our lives that cause suffering, but the stories we tell ourselves about those events, the meanings we assign, the catastrophes we imagine. And yet, this also points to a tremendous opportunity. If our thoughts can create suffering, they can also create resilience, meaning even growth. The concept of post traumatic growth illustrates this beautifully. Researchers have found that many people don't just recover from traumatic experiences, they actually grow from them. They develop deeper relationships, greater appreciation for life, increased personal strength, new possibilities for their future. This growth doesn't happen automatically or universally, but it's more common than we might expect. And one key factor that predicts post traumatic growth is how people think about their experience, whether they can find meaning in it, whether they can integrate it into their life story in a way that promotes rather than diminishes their sense of self. This doesn't mean trauma is good or necessary for growth. No one should have to suffer to develop wisdom or strength. But it does mean that even in the face of genuine hardship, we have some agency in how we interpret and integrate our experiences. Our thoughts about what happened to us can either keep us stuck in suffering or help us move toward healing and growth. The practical implications of this are significant. It means that developing cognitive flexibility, the ability to see situations from multiple perspectives, to generate alternative interpretations, to challenge our automatic thoughts, isn't just about feeling better in the moment. It's about developing resilience for whatever life might bring. It's about building a more robust and adaptable mental framework that can handle uncertainty, setback, loss, and change without being overwhelmed. This kind of resilience isn't about being invulnerable or unaffected by difficulty. It's about being able to bend without breaking, to be touched by life's challenges without being toppled by them. It's about maintaining what Frankl called tragic optimism, the ability to remain hopeful despite the tragic triad of pain, guilt, and death that characterizes human existence. Developing this kind of resilience is a gradual process. It happens through countless small moments of choosing a different thought, of questioning an assumption, of reframing a situation. It happens through practice, through failure, through getting back up and trying again. It happens through self compassion when we fall into old patterns, and gentle persistence in developing new ones. I want to be clear about something. The goal isn't to become someone who never has negative thoughts or never feels distressed. That wouldn't be human. The goal is to develop a different relationship with our thoughts and feelings, one characterized by awareness rather than automaticity, flexibility rather than rigidity, curiosity rather than judgment. It's about recognizing that our thoughts are powerful, but not all powerful, important, but not always accurate, worth attending to, but not worth being enslaved by. This might seem like a subtle distinction, but it makes all the difference. When we're completely identified with our thoughts, when we believe that we are our thoughts, we have no room to maneuver. Every negative thought feels like a threat to our very self. But when we can step back even slightly, when we can observe our thoughts as mental events rather than absolute truths, we create space for choice, for change, for growth. The neuroscience of this is fascinating. Brain imaging studies have shown that different patterns of thinking actually activate different neural networks. Rumination, repetitively thinking about problems without moving toward solutions, activates certain brain regions associated with depression. Reappraisal, looking at situations from different angles, activates regions associated with emotional regulation and executive function. Over time, repeatedly activating certain neural pathways strengthens them, making those patterns of thinking more automatic. This is both sobering and hopeful. It's sobering because it means that years of negative thinking create neural ruts that can be hard to escape, but it's hopeful because it means the brain remains plastic, capable of forming new connections throughout life. Every time we successfully restructure a thought, every time we choose a different interpretation, we're literally rewiring our brains, creating new neural pathways that can eventually become as automatic as the old ones. The timeline for this rewiring varies enormously. Some people report significant shifts in their thinking patterns within weeks of consistent practice. Others work at it for months or years before noticing substantial change. The factors that influence this timeline are complex: the depth of the original patterns, the consistency of practice, the presence of ongoing stressors, the availability of support, individual differences in neuroplasticity. What's consistent is that change is possible, even if it's gradual. I think it's worth addressing the elephant in the room when it comes to cognitive restructuring: the question of whether changing our thoughts is enough. Critics of cognitive approaches argue that focusing on thoughts can be superficial, that it doesn't address deeper emotional wounds or systemic issues that contribute to distress. There's validity to these concerns. Cognitive restructuring isn't a panacea. Someone facing poverty, discrimination, abuse, or illness needs more than thought work. They need material resources, social change, safety, medical care. But I don't think it's an either or situation. Working with thoughts doesn't preclude addressing other levels of intervention. In fact, developing cognitive flexibility can support other changes. Someone who can challenge hopeless thoughts might be more likely to seek help, to advocate for themselves, to persist in the face of systemic barriers. Someone who can reframe setbacks as temporary might be more likely to keep trying when external change is slow. There's also the question of when cognitive restructuring might not be appropriate or might even be harmful. Trying to restructure thoughts in the midst of acute crisis, for instance, is usually not helpful. When someone is in immediate danger or overwhelming distress, the priority needs to be safety and stabilization, not thought work. Similarly, pushing someone to reframe their thoughts about ongoing abuse or oppression can be a form of gaslighting, invalidating their accurate perception of an unjust situation. This is where clinical judgment and ethical sensitivity become crucial. Cognitive restructuring is a tool, and like any tool, it can be misused. Used skillfully and appropriately, it can reduce unnecessary suffering and promote resilience. Used carelessly or ideologically, it can increase distress and perpetuate harm. The key is to approach thought work with nuance and respect for the full complexity of human experience. Thoughts matter, but they're not all that matters. Changing thoughts can be transformative, but it's not always sufficient. Cognitive flexibility is valuable, but so is honoring our emotional truth. The goal isn't to become perfectly rational beings who never have distorted thoughts, but to become more skillful in how we work with the full range of our mental experience. As we wrap up this exploration of cognitive restructuring and stress management, I want to return to where we began, with that moment of interpretation that happens between event and response. That moment is where our freedom lies, not the freedom to control everything that happens to us, but the freedom to choose how we relate to what happens. Not the freedom from difficulty, but the freedom to find meaning and maintain our humanity even in difficulty. This freedom isn't given to us automatically. It's developed through practice, through courage, through the willingness to question our own thoughts, even when they feel absolutely true. It's developed through compassion for ourselves when we fall into old patterns and gentle persistence in developing new ones. It's developed through recognizing that our thoughts are both powerful and changeable, both important and not always accurate. The journey of developing this freedom is deeply personal. What works for one person might not work for another. What helps at one point in life might not help at another. The key is to remain curious, experimental, willing to try new approaches while also honoring what you know to be true from your own experience. If you take nothing else from this discussion, I hope you take this. You have more influence over your mental experience than you might realize. Not complete control, that's neither possible nor desirable, but genuine influence. The thoughts that feel so solid, so true, so unchangeable are actually more fluid than they appear. The patterns that feel so entrenched can shift with patience and practice. The suffering that feels inevitable might be more optional than you think. This doesn't mean that changing your thoughts will solve all your problems or that you're responsible for all your distress. Life can be genuinely difficult, unfair, painful, but even in the midst of real challenges, you have choices about how you interpret what's happening, what meaning you assign, what story you tell yourself. And those choices, small as they might seem in the moment, can make the difference between suffering that crushes you and suffering that deepens your humanity. The work of cognitive restructuring is ultimately the work of freedom, not freedom from the human condition with all its uncertainty and difficulty, but freedom within it. It's about developing the capacity to meet whatever life brings with greater awareness, flexibility, and choice. It's about recognizing that between stimulus and response, between event and emotion, there's a space, and in that space lies your power to choose, to grow, to become more fully who you are capable of being. This is not easy work. It requires courage to question thoughts that feel protective. It requires humility to acknowledge when our perceptions might be distorted. It requires persistence to keep practicing when change feels slow or impossible. But it's work that pays dividends not just in reduced stress or improved mood, but in a fundamentally different relationship with your own mind and through that with life itself. The promise of cognitive restructuring isn't that you'll never have negative thoughts or that life will become easy. The promise is that you can develop a different relationship with difficulty, one characterized by responsiveness rather than reactivity, choice rather than automaticity, growth rather than stagnation. You can learn to work with your thoughts rather than being worked over by them. You can discover that even in constraint, there's freedom. Even in difficulty, there's possibility. Even in suffering, there's the potential for meaning and growth. This, ultimately, is what makes us resilient. Not the absence of struggle, but the presence of choice in how we meet that struggle. Not the elimination of negative thoughts, but the capacity to hold those thoughts lightly, to question them when they're not serving us, to generate alternatives when we're stuck in limiting perspectives. Not perfection in our thinking, but flexibility, curiosity, and compassion in how we relate to our imperfect, thoroughly human minds. As we close today's episode of Strides to Solutions, I want to leave you with this thought. The journey we've discussed today, learning to work skillfully with your thoughts, isn't about perfection or perpetual positivity. It's about developing a kinder, more flexible relationship with your own mind. Start small. Notice one thought today, just one, and ask yourself if there might be another way to look at the situation. You don't have to believe the new perspective completely. Just entertaining it is enough to begin creating new neural pathways. If you're ready to dive deeper into this work, my book, Rescript Your Reality, available on Amazon. It offers a comprehensive roadmap for understanding and recalibrating your inner dialogue, that continuous stream of thoughts and self talk that shapes every aspect of your experience. The book takes the concepts we've explored today and provides practical exercises, real world case studies, and a structured approach to transforming your inner critic into your most powerful ally. Remember, every moment of awareness, every gentle question you pose to your automatic thoughts, every time you choose curiosity over certainty, these are all steps toward greater mental freedom. The path isn't always linear, and that's okay. What matters is that you're walking it. Thank you for joining me today. Until next time, this is Esther Adams reminding you that between stimulus and response, there's always a choice, and in that choice lies your power to grow.